Hey guys, how's it going today? I want to make a quick video on how you can start taking more risks. Now, essentially, I think initially I was a little bit less of a risk taker when I was younger, but nowadays I'm kind of looking to do I guess a little bit more of a risky play when it comes to like for example investing, and that might mean maybe taking on debt. Maybe that might mean trying out new businesses or investing in new alternative assets, for example, like something like Pokemon or cards or maybe cryptocurrency, these kind of things, right? So I wanted to just make a quick video on how you can start taking more risks, the how and the why, and yeah, hopefully you guys can learn something, or take away something. Maybe if you're someone who invests quite safely, maybe you're doing just the S&P, or maybe you're even just saving in a bank account. So anyway, let's get into it. So first point here is that risk is what creates new opportunities, right? Risk, in my opinion, is the cornerstone for leveling up in life. Nothing happens when you're comfortable, right? So this isn't just investing. This is literally everything, right? Nothing good has happened from just being complacent and being comfortable, right? The best things in the world, for example, even like something like McDonald's back in the day, fast food, that was a risk. Electric cars with Tesla, that was a risk. SpaceX, it's a risk. Starting a podcast like Joe Rogan, for example, was a risk at the time. Even jumping from one job to the other, or maybe you're going to a different industry, that's also a risk. So lots of different things that are very impactful and very cool, very interesting, seen as risky initially, right? Even taking on leverage or debt, for example, purchase a property, can be seen as risky. Okay. So some examples here, this could be a talk about getting a promotion. It might not actually lead to anything, but even the idea of having the talk could be seen as a risk. Investing your money is another really good one. A lot of people are scared to lose their money, so that makes sense. Another one here is breaking up with a partner, maybe breaking up with a friend that's not very friendly anymore, maybe they're not very cool anymore. These are all examples of things that are risks, but the outcome, if done right, can be extremely great. Next point here is you don't take risks unless they're calculated and you have a rationale for what makes them worthwhile, right? So you don't want to just do things willy-nilly. You want to have a plan and a reason for doing so, and you also want to have a backup. So in case that risk fails, you want to have a backup. For example, with investing, it could be having cash on the side, or it could be continuing to invest in the S&P, for example, or you have a plan to, if for example, if you're taking on debt for property, to deleverage yourself through purchasing many properties and then maybe selling them down. Another, for example, could be instead of just talking to your partner and potentially having a massive fight, maybe you slowly kind of talk things through, or maybe you get a third party involved to help things out, right? And ultimately, these risks should make sense, as in they should give you a clear ROI or a clear benefit, and make sense to actually just give it a go. Okay. Last point here is that it always starts with something small. For example, investing $5 in the S&P, or maybe in cryptocurrency, and traveling solo domestically could be an example again. My first big trip overseas was solo because I didn't want to wait for anyone else, and it was the best thing I ever could do. I now take trips regularly solo, and it's totally normal to me and works out really well for me. Examples of risks that paid off for me. So, for example, investing into Bitcoin and other crypto in 2019 and using the profit to enter the property market. So for me, this was initially, and then also I kind of sold off and I rebought in, etc. But ultimately, I bought some really good times, and I took what was risky at the time, and kind of see, let it sit. Was comfortable, had a backup plan, etc. And essentially, yeah, it paid off quite well, and they gave me the money to actually purchase my first property. So it was really good. Another example here is investing in the S&P during COVID-19. when the market was scared and exiting at an all-time high at the time, right? So this is another example of where fear was in the market. A lot of people saw that as risky and they didn't want to get involved and they weren't sure where things were going to go. But for me, the S&P made a lot of sense because it was just, the 500 biggest companies, they're not going anywhere overnight. So it was just a temporary thing and I had a good feeling about that. And yeah, I ended up making some good money there as well. Another example here was leaving my current job for another company that paid more, right? Now, at the time, the company had a negative kind of stigma around it, so I wasn't too sure. But ultimately, I ended up enjoying the company and the people much more. There was much more flexibility. There was much more, of an enjoyment, I think. So, well worth it. But at the time, it seemed like a risk. Okay. Next point here is running my first marathon without training properly. It did kill me, but I ended up completing it. My time wasn't that great, but I ended up getting it done, which at the time for someone who didn't really train properly, had no idea about nutrition or anything like that, or fueling, or even wearing the right gear, is quite impressive, I will say. So I've gotten much better now, but that was kind of the risk I took initially. Another point here is having a tough talk with some friends, so no longer friends with those people, that didn't align with my thinking at the time. So that might have meant that they were either, maybe they were spending too much, or maybe they were spending too little, or maybe they weren't investing, or maybe they were very negative all the time. So it's just having those tough conversations with people that, I didn't see myself with long term anyway, and turned out quite well. And I'm no longer associated with any of those people, and the people I associate with are very intentional and very thought out, and they're benefiting my life in one way or another. So it worked out really well. Now, the last point here is how you can actually start taking those calculated risks, right? So doing similar things to me, or anyone that takes risks, right? So I think the first thing to do is identify areas in your life that you feel you're too comfortable. For example, you could be at a job for 5+ years, and you could probably, you're getting bored of it. Maybe it's where you're living in the area. Maybe it's the house. Maybe it's not having a perfect body, or a healthy body. Right? Where are you too comfortable? And then identify things that will progress you and that also scare you. So, for example, moving to a new country within the next month is crazy. But these are the kind of things that we're like, wow, you can really make some cool things happen when you set these scary goals on you. Another example could be, losing 10 kilos in the next month. What does that look like, right? Maybe it's running a marathon next month. Maybe it's booking in the marathon for a month's time and then training to get there. It's going to be scary, but the growth on that would be massive. The next point here is to get info and do research on other people who took similar risks and figuring out how did it end for them. Now, for the most part, they either achieved what they wanted or they almost got there and learnt a lot in the process, much more than they would have done just not doing anything, right? So long story short, I follow a lot of people who run marathons, a lot of people who travel internationally, maybe they invest internationally, and I can kind of see the risks that they're taking, and that for the most part, 99% of the time, they're paying off one way or another, and if not actually achieving what they want, they're learning, which is, again, another reason to take the risk, even if it's not a guaranteed win. Okay. Another point here is to ensure that you have a safety net or similar in case the risk doesn't pay off or you're able to easily reverse. So, for example, maybe it's having $10,000 in savings. Maybe it's being able to, go back to your previous employer if you didn't like it. Or maybe it's being able to easily exit positions if you end up losing money or if you end up losing conviction in that certain investment, for example. Okay. Now, ideally, being able to control most of the outcome, it would be great, but otherwise account for what you can't control. So, for example, doing a marathon, you're in control of that, right? But if you're investing in the stock market, you're not so much in control of that, right? So things you can't control, make sure you account for that. So make sure you have those buffers in place to prevent or protect yourself as much as possible, because obviously not everything is in your control. Those things that we can control, great, but you can't control everything. Okay. Last point here is to start small and build confidence over time. Build that mental muscle, because that's how you kind of you're able to take bigger risks, and people on the outside look at that and go, wow, that's crazy. But for you, you've built up that tolerance over time, that muscle, right? So, what's now $100,000 that I would invest right now was at one point $10. When I started investing, doing some micro investing into stocks or crypto, it always starts very small and then ultimately builds up to something really big when you put that muscle up and you're comfortable taking risks, right? So anyway, that's the video, guys. Hopefully you guys have really enjoyed. If you have any questions, let me know down below. But otherwise, I'll see you guys in the next one. Peace.